All right, awesome. Thanks, Alexa. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jeff Payne, and I've been building and testing software for a long time, 30 plus years. I've run a couple of software consulting companies in the DC area. My most recent company that I started 13 years ago is Coveros, and we help people modernize their software development, test, and delivery process. We do that through agile, DevOps, lean capabilities. I do a lot of speaking on these topics at conferences and am also the technical editor of Agile Connection. If you're not familiar with Agile Connection, it is a free online community of Agile and DevOps professionals. We publish new content, blogs, articles, videos, interviews on a very regular basis. And so if you're interested, just go to agileconnection.com and sign up. Today, we're going to be talking about bureaucracy of all topics, and I'm happy to have with me a special guest. Mark Schwartz is an enterprise strategist at AWS, and he's the author of a whole bunch of books, one of which we're going to talk about today, which is The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy. Prior to joining AWS, he was the CIO at US Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's where I first met Mark. That agency is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And prior to that, he was CIO at a number of tech companies where he got his, I guess you could say, trial by fire being a CIO. He has an MBA from Wharton, a BS in computer science from Yale, an MA in philosophy from Yale as well. So Mark, welcome to the webinar. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you and chat again. We want to dive right into it. Use our time wisely that we have today. So let's get right into your book. And I've got a copy right here. Oops, somebody can see it. Zoom gonna let me show it? Nope, it's the invisible book. Trust me, I have it. There we go. I've got the book. Well dog-eared. Love the book. Let's jump right into it. But before we get into the book, Mark, tell me a little bit about how you decided to become an author, right? And I mean, you didn't just write one book, you've written a bunch of books now. How did you get involved in that process and why? I guess I would love to know.
Sure. Well, I think for each of the books I've written, I had a moment of saying to myself, why hasn't anybody written a book on this topic? You know, the first one was The Art of Business Value. And I was thinking to myself, we talk so much about business value, especially in agile circles, you know, where we say IT initiatives are not just about meeting schedule and budget milestones, they're about delivering business value. And I thought maybe somebody should discuss what that means. What is business value exactly? And why hasn't anybody written a book on this subject? And so I almost had to do it once I had that thought. And that's been the case with each of my books, really, right up to The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy, where I said, bureaucracy is such an important thing in people's lives and in the lives of people who are doing big digital transformations. Why hasn't anybody written about this?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask you how you came up with this topic, but I think you just answered it, right? So
that was it. Yeah. No, yeah, actually, there was a little more to it. What happened was really in my previous books, almost all of them referred to bureaucracy, and almost all of them had this mysterious statement saying something like, bureaucracy can actually add business value. And I thought, you know, perhaps I should explain what I mean. So, so I wrote a book on it.
Nice. Yeah. So I was, I guess I went into reading this book a little bit curious about why you would write a book on bureaucracy. Obviously, having read it now and come through it, I get what your point is there. But could you tell the audience a little bit about, you know, the twist you take on this word bureaucracy, right? And what it really means, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's often a necessary thing, but obviously you want to do it in a way that is productive. Can you talk a little bit about how you define the term and kind of where that thinking came from, and you know, and why you think sometimes it's a necessary thing and it's a good thing?
Yes. What I realized is first of all, bureaucracy is all around us. And sometimes it drives us crazy, but a lot of the time we just don't notice it because it's not driving us crazy. So the book opens with a bunch of examples of things that are really bureaucracy, but you'd never think about it. For example, raising your children. If you happen to be a parent, I think you probably say things like you have to go to bed at 8 o'clock or something like that. And that's a rule. And whenever the child asks for an exception, you probably say, oh no, that's the rule. I'm the boss here, Well, that's classic bureaucracy. Yeah. It is, it fits the definition beautifully. So the definition that I use, I have a little discussion in the book about different ways to define bureaucracy, but I'm using the standard academic definition, which was essentially created by Max Weber, the sociologist, in around 1920 or so. And what it comes down to, I paraphrase Max Weber to simplify it a little bit, but bureaucracy basically is an organizational system that has rigid formal rules and rigid formal roles. So that's the easy way to remember it. It has rules that have to be applied equally in every case, and it has roles where people have authority over different things, and you have to obey their rules. Basically, you have to get their sign off on things, for example. So any organizational system that has those characteristics is probably a bureaucracy. And bureaucracy drives us crazy, I say, when not because of that definition, something that meets that definition doesn't necessarily drive you crazy. It's when it takes on other characteristics that often accompany bureaucracy. And those characteristics are the really bad thing that we have to get rid of.
Yeah, rules and roles. That was a light bulb moment for me, right? I mean, we all live within rules and roles. And I guess I never thought of bureaucracy like that. We'll get into that when we talk about the different ways, right, that you make sure that bureaucracy is done efficiently. But your book talks a lot about your time spent at Homeland Security at USCIS. We were fortunate enough to do at Coveros quite a bit of DevOps and DevSecOps work with you. So I found the book really entertaining because so much of what you talked about, we lived, right? We saw the kinds of things you were putting in place and the activities you were doing to try to, make the process work, the rules and roles in a more lean manner. And that was really entertaining to me. And I'm guessing that experience was the moment you mentioned earlier where you were like, why hasn't somebody written a book on bureaucracy? Because I'm living this bureaucracy and I'm figuring out how to make it work for me. Was that really when the light bulb in your head went on about this particular subject?
Yeah, and then I was holding it in inventory in my head, you might say, for a few years. I said, I know I want to write a book about this, but I'll wait till the right moment when I feel like I'm ready. I found government is great for learning. And in the agile world and in the DevOps world, learning is really important. So I figure government has similar problems to private industry, but it has them much more. It's like a laboratory. If you can solve the problem in the federal government, you can probably solve it in a commercial entity. And bureaucracy is sort of the classic problem or a classic challenge. But when I started to talk about my experience in the government at conferences and stuff like that, after I spoke, people would come up to me and they would say, oh, that sounds just like my company.
Yeah.
We're a bank, we're in financial services, we have all kinds of bureaucracy. And it turned out to be a universal experience. And that's what, got me started looking into examples from different industries and thinking a little bit about why it's always there and why it tends to be in your way.
I'm guessing from all these, you have a zillion references in your book. And also comments at the bottom that are quite entertaining. But I'm guessing you like to read and you like history because you reference some obscure stuff, good stuff that I need to track down and read. But
You should. I mention it because it's worth tracking down.
Absolutely. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing you like to like dig into those kinds of topics and also kind of really drill into it, right? It's not, your books aren't, kind of high level fluff. They're more like, an academic treatise on, this with a real world kind of, veneer on it, right? Is
Yeah.
that kind of your style, you think, how you like to write? And
Yeah, I go a little further. I find that I can't read business books. They bore me. and the same with technology books. And part of the problem for me is that there's sort of a pattern that they all follow. It's like make a point and then give a bunch of examples of it. And usually the examples are just one person's experience and they don't really hold. And then, maybe cite a bunch of statistics. But outside of business books and outside of technology books, most interesting books draw references and analogies to other things. It's like there's a community of writers and scholars and academics where ideas from one discipline cross over into another discipline. But for some reason, business books are never written that way. So I thought, what happens if I try to add dimension to the message, to flesh out what I'm saying by bringing in references to other areas and try to make it sort of resonate, and add a little bit of nuance to the things that I'm saying. So what you're seeing is sort of the result of that experiment.
Yeah, well, you definitely add nuance. It seems like your editor enjoys the process as well, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah. So the subtitle on your book is Digital Transformation with the Monkey, the Razor, and the Sumo Wrestler. And we're going to dive into each of those for just a little bit and get your insights. You say in the book that, these three characters are your assistants, so to speak, as you go through trying to figure out how to make bureaucracy work for you and make it efficient. So let's jump right in and talk about these characters. And you put really kind of principles around them, right? You call a set of principles kind of the way of the monkey, and then the way of the razor and sumo wrestler. So let's start with the monkey, right? The way of the monkey in this character. Talk a little bit about the way of the monkey and who is the monkey, right? And how does the monkey fit into making bureaucracy effective?
Yeah. Well, I started by thinking about the various plays or techniques I'd seen for dealing with bureaucracy. And, in my head, I made a little list of them. And I thought about them and I realized they sort of divide into three categories. The monkey, the razor, and the sumo wrestler is what I decided to call them. But the plays or the techniques that I described, you can think of them in these groups because of the sort of personality of the techniques, you might say. So back to corporate bureaucracy or government bureaucracy. My first principle was it's going to be there. Like you have it, and you're probably glad in some cases that you have it. For example, if you have compliance requirements, and every organization does, you're going to have a really hard time meeting those compliance requirements unless you have some bureaucracy in place. Because compliance requirements generally force you to put in place rules and guardrails and things like that. And they force you to have people who sign off on different things. Sarbanes-Oxley, I think, is the classic. You have to be able to show that you have controls in place and you have people who are responsible and accountable for making sure those controls are applied. And that's exactly my definition of bureaucracy, right? Right. So in any organization, there's going to be bureaucracy. And sometimes it doesn't get in the way, but if you're doing a big transformation, it does get in the way. And then you need to do something about it. And so I start with the way of the monkey. Monkeys, as you know, in all sorts of cultures around the world, monkeys are mischievous troublemakers. And I realized that some of the techniques that I was going to talk about have to do with being a mischievous troublemaker. You know, I think most people who knew me in my government role think of me as a mischievous troublemaker.
I think they do.
The classic play of the monkey is what I call provoke and observe. I didn't make up that term. I stole it from somebody. It's like in agile, you often say inspect and adapt. This is provoke and observe. So what the monkey does is to do something that is provocative, that's probably going to annoy people, and then watch what happens. And you do that in order to learn, because in some cases we learned when we made a provocation, we learned that nobody seemed to care. You know, it's perfectly okay to do something, which is great, because you always thought you weren't allowed to do it, and then it turns out you are, because nobody's going to, you know, fight you on it. Other times you do get resistance, but then based on that resistance, you can figure out all the dynamics around it. You can figure out who's resisting and why they're resisting, and what they might let you do, you know, part way, and all of that. So it's a learning technique, but it's a very active learning technique. I'll give you an example. This was our DHS acquisition oversight framework, good old MD 102, that I love to talk about. And MD 102 required 87 documents to be written. And those documents had templates, and you had to submit a document that had all of the template sections filled in. And the amount of work was amazing, especially when you realize that each of these had to be signed off on by a lot of people, and there were generally rounds of editing and disagreeing and making changes, and then people had to read the thing when you were done. So we said, well, where does it say in the rules that you have to write a long answer to each of the sections of the template? What if we wrote a really short answer? What if we just said like one sentence in each section of the template? And you know, we knew that we'd get a reaction. So we did that, and when we saw the reaction was not as strong as we expected, we pushed it even further. We just started leaving out sections of the template that didn't seem to apply to what we were doing. And the reaction that we got was a surprise. It turned out that the oversight bodies were happy because there was less for them to read. You know, they said, we never intended it to be these really, really long documents. We just wanted to make sure you were thinking about all of these things that were in the template. So provoke and observe in that case actually told us that we didn't have a bureaucracy in our way. You know, we could make some changes that would not be problematic. So that's an example of the monkey. I think that probably makes it clear what I'm thinking. The monkey is the annoying, you know, try something new that's gonna provoke people sort of personality.
Yeah, you mentioned that you know, the document or the standard that you all had to adhere to, and you're wrestling with that throughout the whole book, trying to figure out how to make it work for you, or get an exception to it that would be acceptable to others. As you mentioned, the monkey's all about, you know, kind of change and transformation. You kind of reveal that partway through the chapter. Makes perfect sense, and tied it back to one of your stories up front about one, I think it was Indian culture. I can't recall the culture where they had this character, this monkey character. It turned out that
it's a Chinese legend.
Chinese, okay.
Yeah,
and yeah. It was all about
Journey to the West.
Hands.
It's about it's called The Journey to the West, or Monkey, and it's about a mischievous monkey who gets himself into all sorts of trouble, but in the end he winds up being the ally of the priest, who's sort of the key figure in the story. And so the monkey winds up serving the purpose of advancing Buddhism, essentially, in this case. Even though initially he was such a troublemaker, and he got himself into all sorts of difficulties.
Wow. Yeah, I had heard that. First thing that jumped to my mind, having grown up in the 70s, was Curious George.
Yeah.
So
right.
the book series on the monkey that was always getting in trouble. So
yeah, and it's
similar
across cultures. There are lots of monkeys in different cultures that tend to have those characteristics.
Exactly. Yeah, so a little bit about your thought on transformation and whatnot. You touch a little bit about this in the book. Do you think that someone who is driving transformation has to be at the top of the organization to make it work? Or are there techniques and approaches if you're not at the top to institute the change that you desire? How do you go about doing that if you're not the person near the top?
Right. There are ways to do it. And I think ultimately you need to get somebody at the top to support the transformation. But the mistake that a lot of people or organizations make is they think they can't transform until they get the person at the top to be supportive. And I think that's a bit of a mistake. In fact, starting the transformation gives you traction or a snowball effect, where at some point then you can use that to get support from the most senior people in the organization. I know all of this is true because I approached it from that senior position, but I know that my employees in many cases convinced me to do things. And I could look at what they did, right? I can say, here's how they fooled me on this one, here's what they did. And it worked pretty well. So I sometimes help companies with a strategy for that, because the change agent in an organization might be at the top, or they might be somewhere in middle management, or they might be the hands on the keyboard people with very little organizational power. But from each of those positions, there are certain advantages in driving transformation and certain disadvantages. And I can certainly tell you that when you're trying to drive it from the top, like I was, there are some big disadvantages. You have the advantage of the organizational power, and people listen to you, and you have broad impact across the enterprise. But on the other hand, you're really distant from the action. And with digital transformation, with DevOps and things like that, the action is on the keyboards, right? It's the people who are actually doing things. And I found that with a very vertical organization, it was like a game of telephone. I would say something to the person who reported to me, and then they would repeat it to the people who reported to them, and they would repeat it to the people who reported to them. And by the time the message got to the people who could actually do something, it was a completely different message than what I originally intended. And that tends to happen when you're driving transformation from a leadership position.
No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I can see that working both ways, pros and cons to being at the top.
Exactly.
So let's talk about
be encouraged. I mean that to be encouraging. If you're a change agent, it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, you can do it. You use slightly different techniques to do it. And eventually you need to sell the ideas and get support from the top, but you can do it.
That's awesome. Thanks, Mark. The second character you introduce is the razor. And of course, when I got to this chapter, I had a pretty good idea what the razor was meant for. Turned out to be true. Talk a little bit about the razor and, the purpose and what the razor brings to the table in terms of making bureaucracy work for you.
Yeah, your company does some consulting on lean approaches, you said before. So I had in mind leanness, lean manufacturing, and other lean disciplines. Because I think one of the bad things that often happens in a bureaucracy is bloat and waste. And a lot of people think that's a normal part of bureaucracy or a necessary part of bureaucracy, but it's not. As I said before, bureaucracy just means rigid roles and rigid rules. So it doesn't have to be bloated. And those 87 documents that we had to write for MD 102 for each of our programs, I said, do we really need 87 documents to accomplish the purposes of the SDLC? Maybe we could get the same controls with far fewer documents. And maybe we don't need to write long answers in each section of the template. Maybe we could get exactly the same control over projects, even if we wrote short answers. So to me, the razor is the attempt to make the bureaucracy lean, in the same sense that we talk about lean software development and so on. The title, the name, the razor, is not just meant to evoke the obvious idea of trimming away waste. It also refers to the philosopher Occam, medieval William of Occam, medieval philosopher. He's generally given credit for a principle that goes, something like, given a complicated explanation and a simple explanation, you should prefer the simple explanation, right? That's not really exactly what he said, but it's called the principle of ontological parsimony. You should, when you're explaining something, don't make up all kinds of things and people and gods and whatever. And I thought to myself, there's maybe an equivalent bureaucratic principle that says, if you can have a simple lean process that establishes a control, or a really complicated bloated process that establishes the same control, let's prefer the simple lean one. And that's the razor.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Have you ever coded anything in Occam, by the way? There is a programming language called Occam, right?
I haven't.
Way back?
Yes.
I don't think it ever caught on, but
yeah. Occam is one of those interesting figures from the history of philosophy that, somehow has become associated with this one point, even though he talked about a lot of other things that are interesting, but he's very much associated with this idea of parsimony.
Yep. Yeah, no doubt. One of the quotes you have in this section, which I like, is you say that bureaucracy is a factory whose output is compliance. You mentioned compliance earlier, and I think that's a great way to talk about bureaucracy. But I think some people, though, when they hear the word bureaucracy, and probably me included, I kind of think the output's bureaucrats, right? It's people that get in your way, they're gatekeepers, they control resources, they maybe control progress, they control approvals. How do you best deal with those who would be the bureaucrats in your thinking, your thought process?
Yeah.
The people involved.
Well, first of all, on that comment that bureaucracy is a factory that produces compliance, that's really another way of saying what I said at the beginning of this discussion, which is that bureaucracy can add business value. And it's a value stream, essentially, that adds business value. And the value stream is manufacturing compliance, because compliance sometimes has business value. It lets you operate your business, for example, if you're complying with Sarbanes-Oxley or something. So it is a factory that produces compliance, and you can treat it like any other value stream. You can look at it from a lean perspective and say which steps in this value stream have waste in them, and how short can the lead time be for producing that compliance. So how do you deal with the people who are in the way, acting in a sort of bureaucratic way? I think the techniques that I give in the book, especially the monkey ones, are quite good at dealing with those people. So for example, one of the things I suggest that the monkey do is, actually there are a few now that I think about it, creating urgency is a big monkey technique, where there's something called the status quo bias. It's a cognitive bias that leads people to think the status quo is okay when it's not. We're okay right now. We don't need to change, or at least to not feel any sort of urgency to change. And one of the things the monkey needs to do is to provoke those people into seeing things as urgent. Maybe taking advantage of external circumstances. So the COVID pandemic, of course, was a great one. Don't waste a crisis. It created a lot of urgency for companies, for example, to move to the cloud, because that really gives them the agility to be able to deal with a crisis. It's the monkey who goes around the company and says, do you want the company to go bankrupt next time there's a crisis like the pandemic? this is urgent. We're not going to keep doing things the way that we're doing now. So that's one way to get people to move. But another thing is, I call it personalizing. And so I was in Homeland Security, and the fact is that the bureaucracy in Homeland Security, when it slows things down by saying you have to write 87 documents, is actually making the Homeland less safe. Because why are we doing these programs? It's because they're going to help with the mission of keeping the Homeland safe and secure. And so if it takes much longer to do something because of the bureaucracy that's in the way, then we're actually risking people's lives. And the monkey, of course, is not shy about telling people who are acting like, classic bureaucrats and getting in the way. Are you sure you think it's okay to endanger people's lives just so that we write 87 documents, Because that's really what's happening. I mean, it's just calling attention to something that's a real effect.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's a good one. Let's talk about the Sumo Wrestler. So when I got to this section, the word lean and Sumo Wrestler, those usually don't work well together. Speed and Sumo Wrestler, agility and Sumo Wrestler. How when I got to this, I was like, all right, how's Mark going to pull the Sumo Wrestler into here? What could a Sumo Wrestler actually have to offer? Improving bureaucracy. So tell us a little bit about the Sumo Wrestler and maybe some of the practices that you think are most important there.
Yeah, when you read my book, you can't always tell that I was giggling so much to myself when I put those things together. There's also another connection that you might not have noticed, which is I talk a lot about Moby Dick and the whale. And I think the Sumo Wrestler has some things in common with Moby Dick also,
Did you think about maybe calling this the whale, the section, or the character? Or
I thought the Sumo Wrestler is a little bit more graphic. It gives you a picture in your imagination.
Graphic here, right?
So I like it for that reason. So in sumo wrestling, you have two massive people, and they sort of crash into each other. And the idea of the sumo match is you want to push your opponent out of the ring or get them to fall down, get them to touch the ground with anything beside their feet. And in either of those cases, you win. So if you think about it, it's very nuanced, because if you're a big, humongous sumo wrestler and you want to push your opponent out of the ring, you're probably going to charge them, and push as hard as you can. But what if they step out of the way or, yield, do the, yielding like Jello or a marshmallow or something thing to you? Well, you're probably going to go flying out of the ring yourself or fall down or something. So what really happens in a sumo match is you have these two guys pushing against each other, and each of them is trying to use their opponent's strength against them. If the opponent is pushing really hard and good at pushing hard, well, you don't resist them, you pull. And that's the idea of the sumo wrestler. So the bureaucracy is a big, fat, massive opponent, let's say. And one way you can defeat a big, massive opponent is by using their own strength or using its own strength against it. So, for example, one of the things that we did, I call it call and raise the bureaucracy. We said, yeah, cool, we'll write our own bureaucracy. We'll create our own bureaucracy and use it as a way to defeat the big bureaucracy. So we created our own policy within USCIS that essentially said you have to do DevOps and you have to be agile. And that's what the policy said. And because so much in the government is oriented towards making sure policies get followed, we had the strength of the bureaucracy trying to enforce our policy. And when we got audited by the Inspector General or by GAO, we could say, no, look, right here, it says you got to do DevOps. And so they essentially would be verifying that everybody was doing DevOps, and they'd be on our side in a way. So that's an example of using your opponent's strength against him or her.
No, I like that. That's a good one. The other one I liked was reading the rules.
Yeah.
Right? The practice of actually, finding out what the rules actually are.
Yeah.
So many times everything is verbal, right? No, you're not allowed to do that. Section 8-14 says you can't, or whatever. And if you understand the rules, you'd be surprised what you can get away with. Can you talk a little bit about how reading the rules and, that whole principle helped at Homeland Security?
Yeah, I think a lot of innovators in government find that procurement tends to have a lot of rules that might or might not actually be rules. It's so complicated, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Rule, such a big document with so many complexities that people have all sorts of ideas about what it says, that if you actually look really carefully at what it says, it's not really what you think. So I don't know, when we proposed having in-person challenges for our contractors, where we invited all of the ones who bid on the RFP to do a challenge while we watched. Some contracting folks said, no, you can't do that. And we said, okay, where does it say that in the FAR? Or where does it say something that you're interpreting that way in the FAR? Let's look at it together and see if it really says that, or if there's some way we can meet the rules and the intent of the FAR and still do these kinds of challenges. I think we found something similar on the question of whether non-US citizens could work in a government data center. I think everybody believed that that was a rule. They had to be a US citizen, or a government agency couldn't use a data center that had non-US citizens working there. And that would be a problem for the cloud, because a lot of cloud data centers do employ non-US citizens. So we looked into it. We said, where does the rule come from? And, does it apply? And what we found was something along the lines of, the rule said each agency needs to make a decision on this, and that they should seriously consider the risk. And it turned out that the rule wasn't really applicable. It didn't really say that. And that we could introduce compensating controls, essentially, to accomplish the same objective. So looking really carefully at the rules, sometimes you find that, yeah, the rule more or less does say what people believe, but it leaves room for this kind of an exception, or the intent is this, and if you craft it in such and such a way, you can still do it without that rule getting in the way necessarily.
That's a good point. You'll probably find it humorous that when I started in government contracting, probably early to mid 90s, I read the FAR. I laughed. I sent away for it. Right, this is pre-internet. Ordered it from the printing office, federal printing office, and it came, and it was this humongous thing, and the fonts was like 6-point font.
Right. Yeah.
It was just a heinous document.
Yeah.
The whole thing. My eyes are still bleeding 30 years later from that experience. But yeah, it's a big document.
I'm proud of you. I mean, that's very impressive.
You got to read the rules, right? That's why I resonated with this. I'm a reader. I read the rules. So let's talk.
A copy on my bookshelf,
okay.
so I could read the rules.
Could read the rules.
But yeah. I didn't go cover to cover.
Okay. I think you did all right with it anyway. So let's talk about being a bureaucratic black belt. You mentioned earlier DevOps, right? And how DevOps plays into all of this, how you can leverage DevOps and automation of delivery to meet the needs of a bureaucracy. Can you talk about what being a bureaucratic black belt means, and how does DevOps and CI/CD and automation fit into this whole process? How do we roll this back around to agile and DevOps concepts?
So this is the bonus chapter in the book, essentially. After talking about how you get through bureaucracy and still do a transformation, I thought, just as a bonus, let's ask ourselves how you could set up a good bureaucracy if you are a really good bureaucrat. Excuse me. And so in that chapter, I give 16 different plays or techniques that you'd want to use if you were a really good bureaucrat to set up a bureaucracy that added value and didn't have those problems that I talked about in relation to bureaucracies. I like to use the example of DevOps because if you take that academic definition I gave you before, in many ways, you would have to say that DevOps is bureaucracy. And what I mean by that is it's easiest to see if you think of an example. So in old school software development, you often have change control of some sort when you're going to deploy an application to production, right? You have maybe a change control board, and you have a formal process and you have to get sign-offs that it's okay to deploy something. Well, you don't do any of that in DevOps. But what you do is you have an automated process that doesn't let you do a deployment unless the code has passed all of its automated tests. And you do the deployment through scripts, and the scripts they're set, they don't vary. They do exactly what they do. Yeah, they're rules. And you put rules in production. In the cloud, we do this a lot. We have policy enforcement in the cloud in production. And so in a way, you're doing exactly the same thing that was done bureaucratically before, but you're doing it in an automated way. So the bureaucracy hasn't gone away. It's just been automated. You still have to make sure the code passes all of its tests. Before, the change control board might have looked at documentation that proved that it passed all the tests and then say, yes, it's okay to deploy. Now we don't have to go through that, but there's still code that enforces the fact that it passed all of its tests. And you still have ways to roll back if something goes wrong with the deployment, which the change control board probably would have forced you to do before. But now you can do it in an automated way using DevOps in the cloud. So all of those same controls that were applied in the bureaucracy before are still applied, but in an automated way. So I suggest you can think of that as automated bureaucracy. And that's a great tactic for making the bureaucracy palatable and productive and lean, is wherever you have bureaucracy, try to automate it. And DevOps, great example of how to do it. Similarly, for security controls, instead of someone at the end coming in and doing security testing and then saying, well, that doesn't meet our security rules, it doesn't comply, which would be old school bureaucracy. In many cases, we would have the security team write automated tests that would do security testing of the code and do it very thoroughly. And if the code passed those security tests, it was ready to be deployed. Well, the same bureaucracy is still there. The security folks have, they still are the people responsible. They still have the authority and they can decide whether code should be deployed or not. But they exercise that authority by providing automated tests that the code has to pass. So the bureaucracy hasn't gone away. It's just become really efficient and lean and enabling. It enables the software developers to do their own security testing, essentially, as they're coding. So this is the core, I think, of being a black belt bureaucrat, of being a really good bureaucrat, is to take advantage of all these opportunities to automate bureaucracy and make it thereby lean and enabling and able to change, and all of the other characteristics of good bureaucracies.
Very cool. Yeah, and to your point, one of the other things about automation that people sometimes forget is if you create it properly, it always does the same thing.
Yeah.
So you've got a built-in guarantee that the rule will be followed as long as you have successfully set it up. And that should ease the mind of the auditors, the bureaucrats, those that want to make sure the rules are followed. There's no way not to follow the rule.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
the
the
automation
controls are
is done
even
properly.
better, right? And they're
Exactly.
also self-auditing in a way.
Mhm.
So, you know, if you have a person who's trying to enforce the rules, you don't know if maybe they were lax or not paying attention or something. You know, there isn't really the audit trail to say they paid attention and enforced the rule. But if you automate the bureaucracy, then you can track from the audit trail whether the rule was applied or not. You can track when somebody changed the rule and what process they went through to change it. You know, all of these things suddenly become auditable with no extra effort on the part of the people who are the bureaucrats.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Great stuff. So for those of you that don't have the book, get the book. Mark works at AWS. It's part of Amazon. Just go to Amazon and get it.
That's right.
Everyone's going to receive a copy of this presentation for your use after the webinar, obviously. It does have a clickable link in it, but of course, come on, just go to Google and go to Amazon and get Mark's book. We are going to take questions in a minute after I go through some announcements, but thank you, Mark, for sharing your thoughts on the book and the different characters. It was very interesting to hear your perspective on this. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So before we take questions, just a few things we want to do. One is we want to do a quick audience poll. And I want to know how agile you think your bureaucracy is. From 1 is nope, we don't have any of this, to 5 is, hey, we got all this covered. Our bureaucracy is perfect. Go ahead and submit your answers, and then we'll take a look at how agile do you think your bureaucracy actually is. I'd say just based on our customers, I mean, they tend to be in the middle, right? I mean, most are doing something, you know, whether it's focusing on DevOps and CI/CD automation and putting quality gates and security gates and things like that in place. But I don't know that many of them would say, like, you know, we're Netflix, right? Or something where they're like way out on the cutting edge of, probably getting their entire process to be a continuous, delivery or deployment process.
Yeah, one of the challenges is making that jump from doing the technical practices of DevOps to making the most of DevOps organizationally, causing the organizational change around the technology that makes a difference.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And you mentioned the cloud, right? I mean, you talk to so many global, CIOs all the time. You're talking to them, and I'm sure you hear a lot, because I hear it, is, we don't know how we can get there. We've got on-prem stuff, and it's, we've got all this compliance. We have all this regular, we have this, we have that. There's a million excuses why they can't leverage the cloud that usually aren't founded in like reality. It's more, resistance to change, investments already made. What would my boss say if now I go to the cloud after I just spent, $30 million on this new production, environment or whatever.
Yep, all of those things.
Hear that?
Yeah, we hear all of those things. I sometimes say, working in the cloud actually is easy, technically. I mean, we're technologists. We know how to learn new technologies, and the cloud is deliberately set up to be pretty easy. What's hard, though, is getting the business value out of it, making the changes to the organization that you can make once you're in the cloud. And that's where everybody stumbles. Yeah,
no, I agree. So we did end up right in the middle. Looks like a bell curve to me.
Look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're making progress, which is where you would expect expect people to be. So thank you audience for sharing that. As mentioned, we are going to take a couple questions, but right before we do that, I want to mention one thing. One is we have a couple of classes coming up that are relevant to this discussion. We have our DevSecOps class happening in March. Our Foundations of DevOps class is in May. Our big Agile DevOps conference is in June. We usually are in Vegas for that. Not this year. We'll be sitting here in Zoom or another platform. But please, if you're interested in that, sign up. And one piece of that that's very popular is I lead our Agile DevOps Leadership Summit, which is always on the last day of the conference. Anybody that's interested in leadership that's attending the conference, this is an opportunity to do some peer-to-peer discussions around leadership. And also we have a couple of great speakers as well. I'm also teaching our Agile and DevOps Leadership class. It is a certification class through IC Agile. That's coming up in June. And as a thank you for anybody that came to the webinar today, there's a promo code here. You can apply that to any of the classes that are coming up to save 20% just as a thank you for attending. I'll also mention that if you're not a member of the hub, you should be. We have over 6,000 software professionals who are members of the hub. It's free. Go to hub.techwell.com. It's a Slack-based community. Professionals are asking questions, sharing best practices, talking about upcoming, free events and other activities. It's just a great place to share and engage with the software community. And there's topics on Agile and DevOps and AppSec and testing, as well as leadership as well. So if you're not a member, definitely sign up and check it out. And then I do want to mention our next webinar. So on May 27th, I'm going to have, we're going to do a panel/debate. I like to call it a debate. If you know Rob Sabrin and Johanna Rothman, they have been in the testing community for a long time, before Agile existed, at least as a name, right? And we're going to debate whether Agile has helped or hurt testing. There are a lot of opinions out there about that, and we're going to discuss it and debate it. So definitely join me for this debate on May 27th. It's kind of in ode to this being the 20th anniversary of the Agile Manifesto happening, which was last month. So we figured we'd do something that would kind of put a pin on Agile, and we're going to focus on whether it's been good or bad for testing as a role, as a discipline, as a process. And we'll go a lot of different ways with it. So it should be a lot of fun. So let's turn it over to, is it Pam or Alexa, who's going to run questions today? And let's take some questions from the audience.
Sure. Our first question is, what's your perspective on the scale of change that should be used for transformations?
The scale of change. Okay. So I would draw a distinction. There may be two different questions. One is how quickly do you make the change? Because eventually you want to change the organization. The scale is going to be as big as your organization is, but what's going to be your process for getting there, and how quickly? And then the second question is, what do the intermediate steps look like? So the way that I would think about it is you always start with a very thorough vision. I don't know what the right word is, a strong vision for where you want to get to. And I think now we can more or less imagine what it should look like. It should be DevOps, it should be microservices, it should be the cloud, it should be user-centric design. And that's the end state you're shooting for. How you get there, best practice for everything Agile that we do is incrementally, right? So I always ask myself, what's the smallest thing we can do in the next week or so that's going to move us towards that final goal? So you move incrementally. Maybe you start with one agile team or two agile teams, and then you grow, the part of the company that's been converted to more agile ways of working and more agile ways of thinking. That's fine, keeping in mind where you're trying to get to and managing risk and upskilling based on starting smaller and growing. However, the mistake I've seen a lot of organizations make is to not just move incrementally in terms of scale, but to move incrementally in terms of what they're doing. Sometimes people will say things like, it's really a big change to DevOps, so let's do sort of halfway DevOps first. That, I think, is a terrible anti-pattern. Why not just do it right? Yeah, okay, it's a big change, but you're going to do it on a small scale. And so you're managing your risk that way. Never ask people to do something that's the wrong way to work, which is what you're doing if you do, water scrum fall or, some other,
you call it.
Yeah, whatever you're going to call it, right? A halfway measure. So I recommend against that, even though I recommend moving incrementally towards the final vision.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
So along those lines, a common approach for agile transformations is selecting a team as a pilot and then scaling it around. What is your opinion on that? Is there a better way, or does that work best?
So it fits with what I said before about being incremental, right? I'm first going to take issue with the term pilot. We all mean different things when we use that term. For me, you do everything with commitment. You don't say, we're doing this just as a pilot. You do it. You just do it, And yes, you get feedback from doing it, and you learn from doing it, and you might decide to change how you're doing it. But you don't do something tentatively as a pilot if you know it's the right thing to do or the right general direction. You finish. Sometimes when people talk about pilots, they mean creating software that's not actually going to be used. That's just going to be, doing a proof of concept or something. Again, I generally recommend against that. Proofs of concept are used in some cases to mitigate specific risks. If you've identified a risk, you do a proof of concept maybe to test out that risk and mitigate it. But as a general rule, instead of doing proofs of concept, you should create software that people can use with the intention of them using it. So I don't know that I believe in pilots in that sense. One pattern that we found works really well with moving to the cloud, for example, is to create a center of excellence. I hate that term, but a cloud center of excellence. Essentially get one team trained up that is doing everything right. That team really understands how to work in the cloud. And then use that team as a lever to get other teams trained up, to spread good practices, to be available as a reference, to build reference architectures or even better platform architectures and things like that. Because once you have that one team that's really good at doing everything DevOps or everything cloud, then other teams can pair with them, consult them, whatever, and in that way, other teams can develop their skills as well, and then you can expand the scale of the transformation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there, Mark. I mean, we have a model at Coveros that we use when organizations are interested in either call it a pilot or a first project or whatever you want to call it, to make sure that they're thinking through the right kind of project, and that they're thinking about this as we're fully committed. So we look at things like, how strong is the business sponsorship in this particular area of the organization? How big of an effort is this going to be? You don't want it to be tiny, but you don't want it to be like, it's going to take 4 years or something. What's the duration, and how critical is it, right? Because you want to be careful when you're experimenting. You want it to not be a toy, but you don't want it to be a bet the entire company on this project, kind of a, project either. So we try to, weigh all those and give advice, because you're right. I mean, if it's not something that's fully dedicated to and that is a real in-band effort, then you're probably not gonna get the buy-in.
Yeah. The idea obviously is to learn as you go, but you learn a lot more by actually producing final product and putting it in the hands of users. So that should always be a goal. Also, sometimes we recommend, yes, go ahead and start with a really small project just to make sure that you've managed your risks and that you've got the skills, but then go for something mission critical. And the reasoning, and it doesn't apply to every company, but often this is a good approach, because you often still have this fear, uncertainty, doubt thing going on around the company. And if you do a mission critical application, you move it to the cloud or move it to a DevOps practice, then nobody can say after that, oh, it might not work, might not work for mission critical systems. You sort of overcome their hesitation and their doubts by doing such a, committed, difficult project early on. But you don't do a 40-year project. You still do it in small increments like anything else Agile.
Okay, looks like we have one more question. Mark, you mentioned in the Agile and DevOps world, learning is very important. Can you speak a little more about that from both an organizational side and from a leader's personal responsibility?
To me, this is the core principle of Agile, really. So what does it mean to be Agile? It means that your highest value is not on sticking with a plan you made before you started. It's changing course as you learn. It's based on the principle of inspecting and adapting. And so what you're trying to do is, as you proceed on an initiative, you are constantly reflecting on how you're doing, what you've learned, and making decisions about what you're going to do next. Rather than saying, we have this original plan, what we do next has to be whatever was in that original plan. That's what it means to be Agile. That's the base definition. Although particular Agile frameworks might have all sorts of other things in order to implement that idea, like a backlog and grooming and stuff like that. But the idea of being Agile is change. Embracing change. And you don't just make arbitrary changes, you make changes based on what you've learned along the way, or changes in your environment that you've learned about as you've proceeded. That's Agile. Now, DevOps takes this a step further. DevOps actually tries to, how should I put it, institutionalize a feedback process. So with DevOps, you've got a team that can run what they build. They manage the entire life cycle of something, from development to testing, securing, creating the infrastructure, and then operating in production, monitoring and collecting feedback on how their code is performing, and then feeding that back and continuing to tweak what they've created until it fully accomplishes the purpose it was created for. And so DevOps often talks about fast feedback cycles. That's the essence of what you're trying to do, is create this learning loop where you put something in production, see how it's working, and then make changes based on that until you're getting the business effect that you wanted. The feedback loop is not necessarily what most people mean when they talk about feedback. It's not a question just of asking users, do you like this? It's generally feedback that's quantitative, that's based on monitoring how users actually behave, or monitoring against your business goal, whether you're actually accomplishing it. So for example, we had an online application form And we discovered that only 40% of the people who started filling out that form actually finished filling out that form. And so our goal was to get that closer to 100%, of course. And we developed some features and put them in production. And then the next step always is you measure again how many, what percentage of the people are actually completing the process. And hopefully you're seeing some improvement. And you're saying, did this fix the problem entirely, or is there still more ground to cover to get to 100%? And that's the feedback. And you make some more changes and see their impact, and you just keep doing that till you get to whatever percentage you're shooting for. That's fast feedback, and that's learning cycles.
Awesome. Well, I know we're out of time, Mark. Thanks again for coming on the webinar and sharing your thoughts on the book and for DevOps and Lean and Agile in general. Appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone for attending.